over here. Bureau Christian Church is pleased to sponsor tonight's debate. Subject of origins. Origins is a very basic, very important subject. For who among thinking people has not asked, where did man come from? Where did the plants and animals come from? Or what is the source of the stars and the earth and the universe? So tonight's debate concerns those questions and their answers. The debate subject, the theory of evolution versus the theory of special creation, as an explanation for the scientific evidence related to origins. Debating in support of special creation is Dr. Dwayne Gish, who's sitting on my left. We're pleased to have him with us. He is the Vice President for the Institute for Creation Research at El Cajon, California, and additional bibliography and biographical is included in the inserts that you have, the bulletins. And debating in support of evolution, on my right, is Dr. David F. Fisher, who is the Professor of Cosmochemistry at the University of Miami. Acting as moderator of tonight's debate is Martin Schnipper, who is debate coach at Vero Beach High School. Before beginning the debate, I'd like to call attention to the insert sheets in your bulletin. You will have the opportunity to participate in the debate by writing out questions that you might have. And those questions will be picked up by ushers in the 10-minute intermission following both of the initial presentations. Also, you'll find a questionnaire in the bulletin, and if you would, we'd ask you to complete that and then turn that in as you leave this evening. At this point then, I'd like to turn the program over to Martin Schnipper, debate moderator.
If you'll check the white sheet, it has the debate guidelines in it. Most of this is self-explanatory for you. There is one change, however, and that is immediately behind the recess. It says first rebuttal, party 2. That will be changed to party 1. And then the first rebuttal for party 1 is changed to party 2. So therefore, the sequence in all instances is 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. The timing is going to be accomplished in a countdown mode using these cards. I'll be seated over there. When the time has elapsed, I'll stand. The written guideline, the written questions that you have on the sheet are going to be important on the back of this white sheet. And if you write them, even though I am used to grading high school students' papers and I'm used to sort of hieroglyphics, and I was a medic in the service and I'm used to doctors writing, it still would be somewhat easier for me to be able to have it neatly written, and I'll be able to read the questions better. There's no guarantee that we'll be able to get to every single question. A deliberate attempt will be made to make certain that we have equal amounts of questions for each of the people here. The oral comments from the audience need to be somewhat restricted. I understand that a number of you are going to have very strong feelings on one side or another. This is not a participatory debate in the sense of what you would expect in, say, the British House of Commons or something like that. So if we could keep that one down a little bit. In addition, if you could, at least for the purposes of this debate, keep an open mind and listen to the arguments rather than have your favorite side that's going to win. I always tell my debaters to be prepared to debate both sides of the questions, and they do that when they're off on interscholastic debates. They're affirmative one round, negative the next, affirmative the next, and so forth. So, if you can listen for that, through rhetoric, hopefully truth will prevail. Movement and distractions, if you can keep those down to an absolute minimum. The tough time is going to be the first two speeches, and probably the second of those two speeches. Perhaps we ought to have about 1 minute time period between the two when you can stand up and stretch just a little bit. And we'll go with that. Restrooms, of course, on the outside, if you absolutely have to go, try and keep it at a reasonable movement. If you're in the middle, especially try and hold it. We've already had the coin toss. Dr. Gish is party 1, and Dr. Fisher is party 2. So let the debate begin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Snipper. Ladies and gentlemen, certainly is my pleasure to be with you here this evening and to have this opportunity to present for your consideration some of the results of my research on the subject of origins. Now, origins is a controversial subject. Certainly, creation versus evolution seems to be quite controversial today. But I certainly trust that we'll have a cordial exchange of views this evening. While we may disagree, we will agree to disagree, and then we'll still part friends. And of course, I have to be on my best behavior tonight. I have my wife and some of her relatives with us tonight. And I see Dr. John Eckersley and his wife from Stewart, and he's on our board. And so that's some special reasons why I must be on my best behavior. But certainly I believe we will have a cordial and very, I believe, an informative exchange of views. And I trust that when we leave here this evening, all of us will have gained a new insight into the subject of origins. Now, I want to make clear some of the things we are not debating here tonight. We are not debating the biblical record of creation. We are not debating anybody's theology. We're not even debating the age of the earth. Not when, but what we are here to debate tonight is how did the universe and the living organisms it contains come into existence? Did they come into existence by some naturalistic, mechanistic, evolutionary process that can be ascribed to properties inherent in matter? Or did they come into being through the direct, deliberate, creative acts of an intelligent, supernatural creator? That is the subject that we are here to debate tonight. Let me say very briefly about the nature of science, that there can be no scientific theories on origins. You see, there were no human witnesses to the origin of life. There were no human witnesses to the origin of the universe. There were no human witnesses to the origin of a single living thing. These events happened only once, and they happened in the unobservable past. Now, you cannot construct scientific theories about events of that kind. Creation and evolution are inferences based upon circumstantial evidence. They are historical theories. We are trying to explain what has already taken place. Now, in that sense, certainly evolution is no more scientific than creation. And I believe actually it's much less scientific. And creation is no more religious than is the theory of evolution. Because, you see, you have the choice, either a creator or no creator. And they both involve world views, metaphysical views, or basically religious views. Now, certainly they can be discussed in scientific terms, as we will do tonight. You can construct scientific models about origins. But you cannot construct a testable, falsifiable theory about origins. Now, I want to make one other thing clear. Anybody, if the question comes up about our credentials as a scientist, I am a scientist. I have my doctorate in biochemistry. I spent 18 years in scientific research, during which time I published many scientific papers in standard scientific journals, co-authoring some of those papers with 2 Nobel Prize winners. And of course, we just might point out that they question our scientific credentials. The only degree that Darwin ever received was in theology. And Richard Leakey, who is upheld as one of the world's leading evolutionists today, does not have a PhD degree. As a matter of fact, he's never spent one single day in college. The only thing he has is a high school diploma. And so it's not a matter of degrees Not a matter of anything like that. It's a matter of evidence. How did this universe come to exist? What is the evidence that we have? Well, I don't care what you call creation or evolution, whether you call them religions or whether you call them metaphysical or whether you call them science. It's immaterial. The issue is, what's the truth? What evidence do we have, you see, to support these two possible positions? Now, according to the theory of evolution, the universe started out with a big bang or something similar to that. The evolution says some billions of years ago, all the energy and matter of the universe was crammed together in some huge cosmic egg, a plasma ball of subatomic particles and radiation heated to trillions of degrees. No one had the slightest idea where the cosmic egg came from, how it got there. Someone suggested perhaps the cosmic chicken made the cosmic egg. Well, I never heard a better scientific explanation than that yet. But there it was. And then, for some equally inexplicable reason, this cosmic egg exploded. Now, out of that explosion, two things were generated: hydrogen and helium. The two lightest elements in the universe, that's all. No carbon, no nitrogen, no phosphorus, no sulfur, uranium, lead, iron, copper, nothing like that. Just these two gases, and they spread out through the universe. Highly dispersed, very cold temperature, in a homogeneous fashion. Somehow we are told from this highly dispersed cloud of essentially hydrogen gas that stars created themselves, and galaxies created themselves, our solar system created itself. Life evolved on this planet, and that first speck of life evolved into everything living today, including you and I, with our 30 trillion cells of over 200 varieties, and with our brain, and maybe we have that first slide, please, and we'll see what we have in the human brain. In the human brain, we have more than 12 billion brain cells, and since each brain cell is connected to more than 10,000 other brain cells, we have in excess of 100 trillion connections in the human brain, the most complex arrangement of matter in the universe. Where did that come from? From hydrogen gas, you see. And if this is true, then we could say that hydrogen is an odorless, tasteless, invisible gas, which, if given enough time, becomes people. Now that is essentially what they believe, because you see there was nothing but hydrogen gas then, now there's people. So where do we come from? Ultimately from hydrogen gas. So hydrogen gas then is our creator. That, to me, is an incredible notion. I don't know how any intelligent scientist could believe it, but this is what is accepted. Of course, there were a few billion years involved. I just don't think time is any help. You see, if you say a frog changed into a prince instantaneously, that's just a fable. I would agree with that. But if you say a frog or something like that changed into a prince and it took 300 million years, that's supposed to be science. I just don't think 300 million years helps the situation at all. But this is what is suggested. Now, this process was a process of self-transformation. It occurred according to properties inherent in matter. God was not involved. God was not necessary. By definition, God is excluded from this process. That is the theory that is being taught in our colleges and our universities today and in most schools. It was a totally naturalistic, mechanistic, non-theistic process. I am not saying that all evolutionists are atheists. As a matter of fact, most are not. But the theory itself is a non-theistic theory. You might as well call it an atheistic theory, because by the very definition of theory, God is excluded from the process. Now that's the general theory of evolution. You see, life evolved here on the earth. That first form of life evolved into everything else. So we have the particles, the people. Theory of evolution, I sometimes call it the fish to Gish theory of evolution. So we know what we're talking about. And all of this process going from hydrogen gas to people, it was involved in evolution. Now, that's the general concept. Now, there are different kinds of evolution. There's the slow and gradual evolution, the neo-Darwinians. There's the hopeful monster people who believe that the first bird hatched from a reptilian egg, just boom like that. A reptile laid an egg and a bird was hatched from the egg, and that's why you don't find transition points between reptiles and birds. There just weren't any. That's called the hopeful monster mechanism. And there are other kinds of evolution. Some even believe in inheritance of acquired characteristics. But all of it fits under this general umbrella of evolution. Now, among the creations, there's a variety of creations too. Some creations would date the earth very young, believing in a 6-day creation. Others say, no, the Bible, for example, does not date creation, and the days of creation could be long periods of time. They're called progressive creationists. They believe that various acts of creation was spaced over this vast stretch of time. There are some gaps, theorists, and so forth and so on. So there's various kinds of creations. But again, all of that fits under the general umbrella of creation. Also, the Navajo Indians, Hindus or whatever, who believe in any sort of a supernatural creation, you see, that would fit under this general umbrella of creation. The basic question then is, was it naturalistic, mechanistic, evolutionary development, or was it by the deliberate acts of an intelligent creator? That's the two general things that we are discussing here tonight. Now, we're 130 years after Darwin. Darwin recognized there's some very serious problems with his theory. He knew the fossil record did not produce the transitional forms, the intermediate types demanded by his theory. He knew that. But he hoped that the future would take care of the problem and that we would fill in those gaps. Over 130 years after Darwin, and the missing links are still missing. And more evolutionists are beginning to recognize that fact and to try to deal with it. And so they're trying to come up with other theories. I mentioned the hopeful monster theory. And there's the so-called theory of Gould and others like that, punctuated equilibrium, sort of herky-jerky, and so forth and so on. And so there's a lot of infighting among evolutionists today, a lot of quarreling and so forth and so on. Some are defending the old guard, some are pleading these new ideas, and some are saying we just don't know. And so there's a lot of turmoil here now. Most of them are still evolution. However, creation science certainly make up a very significant fraction of scientists today. A poll taken by industrial chemists showed at least 21% of the scientists in the United States were creationists. And large numbers would admit that they're creationists if they weren't discriminated against. So the creationists make up a very significant fraction of the scientists today, and the number is growing quite rapidly. So I'm not saying that all of these people are becoming creationists. Most of them are still remaining evolutionists. But they have a lot of this infighting. 4 years ago, April 8, 1985, an article appeared in Newsweek. That's April 8, 1985. On page 80, the author was Sharon Bagley. The title of the article was Science Contra Darwin. She says in the initial statement, that is Science Against Darwin. She said in the initial statement here, the great body of work deriving from Charles Darwin's revolutionary 1859 book on the origin of species is under increasing attack, and not just from creationists. Then a little bit later, after discussing some of this infighting and so forth and so on, she says this: so heated is the debate that one Darwinian says there are times when he thinks about going into a field with more intellectual honesty. The used car business. My apology to any used car salesman in the audience. Of course, it wasn't a creationist who said that, it was an evolutionist. Now here's a book entitled Evolution, A Theory in Crisis by Dr. Michael Denton. Dr. Denton has 2 earned doctorates from British University, an MD and a PhD in molecular biology. He is not a Christian. He doesn't even make any profession of being a creationist. But his book is a devastating critique of evolution theory. On every count, according to Dr. Denton, evolution strikes out. By the way, he's in genetic research in Australia at the present time. And on the top of the book, we read this: the theory of evolution, as propounded by Darwin and elaborated into accepted fact, quote unquote, by biologists, is in serious trouble. This sober, authoritative, and responsible book by practicing scientists presents an accurate account of the rapidly accumulating evidence which threatens to destroy almost every cherished tenet of Darwinian evolution. End of quote. And by Darwinian evolution, they are referring to the modern, up-to-date theory of evolution. Now, no one can accuse Dr. Denton of being biased or anything like that. He's approaching this subject in a totally objective manner. And his conclusion on every count, evolution fails. And there's only one other alternative to evolution, that's creation. A few years ago, I was invited to Jerusalem to participate in the first annual conference on origins and evolution, organized by some Israeli scientists. Both evolutionists and creationists have been invited. There I heard Soren Lovetrop lecture. Now, Dr. Lovetrop is a famous Swedish scientist, well known around the world for his work in science and embryology and so forth. He is an evolutionist. But the moment I heard him speak, I knew that he was not a Darwinian. He did not believe in slow and gradual evolution. He did not believe in the modern Darwinian theory. Didn't accept it, that we have the fact that things appear suddenly, fully formed, gaps and so forth. So he sort of embraced this hopeful monster mechanism. He wrote a book in 1987 entitled Darwinism, the Refutation of a Myth. Darwinism, the Refutation of a Myth. Now, by Darwinism, he's referring to the modern day, currently taught theory of mutations and natural selection and so forth, which is called neo-Darwinism. That's what he means by Darwinism. Now, he set forth why he didn't accept it, why he thought the evidence was against it. He set forth his ideas on this sort of hopeful monster mechanism. Then his concluding statement, he said this. Now, when I quote this statement, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to realize what he called the Darwinian myth is being taught in practically every college and university in the United States, in fact throughout the world, as an established fact. It is dogma, not to be questioned. This is what he said about that. This evolutionist, famous scientist, quote, I believe that one day the Darwinian myth will be ranked the greatest deceit in the history of science. I want you to think about that a moment. What does he say? This Darwinian myth, he says, someday will be recognized as the greatest deceit in the history of science. And that is being taught as dogma, as established truth in most schools and colleges and universities in the United States today. And that's a statement by an evolutionist himself. Now, we creation scientists go one step beyond that. We say not only is the Darwinian mechanism, neo-Darwinian mechanism, the modern concept that is so universally accepted, not only is that the greatest deceit in the history of science, but the very concept of evolution itself is the greatest deceit in the history of science. Not that these evolutionists are dishonest, not that they are deliberately purveying untruths, but it is wrong. They have been deceived, and they have accepted this notion, and they have tried to make their evidence fit it, and it's actually the greatest deceit in the history of science. Now, what is some of this evidence we'd like to call to your attention tonight? Well, I think you would agree, if everything started with the Big Bang billions of years ago, in the chaos and disorder of the Big Bang, and all of this matter just transformed itself into the cosmos, so that we went from hydrogen gas to people. We went from disorder to order. We went from the simplicity of hydrogen gas to the complexity of the human brain. That matter must have that ability. Matter must have a natural tendency to transform itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex, to higher and higher levels of organization. That must be a property of matter. Evolution is true. It's got to be true. Think of it. This universe with its highly dispersed cloud of hydrogen gas, and look what we have in the universe today. And if matter did that, then it's got to have that tendency. And Scientists should have recognized that tendency. We ought to have a natural law today which describes such a tendency of matter. On the other hand, the creation should expect something very, very different, wouldn't we? If God created this universe, then certainly we would not expect that matter would have a natural tendency to transform itself to higher and higher levels of organization. We would not expect that at all. But if something has happened since creation to change the initial created state, since it cannot promote matter upward, the only thing that can happen is it might cause matter to go downward. We might expect on the basis of creation that matter would have a natural tendency to go from order to disorder, from complex to simple. That might be something we would expect to find based upon creation. So we have diametrically opposed theories. We have evolution saying things went this way, and they ought to be going still in that direction, shouldn't they? On the basis of creation, we expect things might be going that way. Well, let's go out there in this very real world and let's just take a look. Let's see what's going on out there. First of all, I want to point out no scientist has ever recognized any inherent tendency of matter to transform itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex. That does not happen spontaneously, naturally, all by itself. That's not a property of matter. We don't have a natural law which describes any such property of matter. But there is a natural law called the second law of thermodynamics, which describes precisely the opposite tendency. There is a universal natural tendency for all systems to go from order to disorder, from complex to simple. There are no exceptions. From the scale of the galaxy down to the level of the molecule, that is always the tendency. Everything tends to go in that direction. In other words, everything's going in the wrong direction for evolution to be successful, for the universe to have wound itself up. As a matter of fact, the entire universe is winding down. The universe is constantly becoming less and less orderly. I'm going to allow Isaac Asimov to define that property for us. See down here in the next slide? This is a statement by Isaac Asimov, famous evolutionist, a very strident anti-creationist, written over 300 books. This is found in an article published in the Smithsonian Institute Journal, June of 1970, on page 6. Notice what Isaac Asimov has to say about the second law of thermodynamics. He says, stated that way, we can see the second law all about us. We have to work hard to straighten a room, but left to itself it becomes a mess again, very quickly and very easily. Even if we never mirror it, it becomes dusty and musty. How difficult to maintain houses and machinery and our own bodies in perfect working order. How easy to let them deteriorate. In fact, all we have to do is nothing. And everything deteriorates, collapses, breaks down, wears out. All by itself. And that is what the second law is all about. End of quote. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if that is what the second law of thermodynamics is all about, it seems to me evolution is in trouble. Notice, everything goes in the wrong direction for evolution. Everything wears out, runs down, deteriorates, decays. That's natural. That's spontaneous. Now remember, evolution is supposed to be a natural process. It's supposed to be a spontaneous process. It's supposed to be happens all by itself. Didn't get any help, didn't need any help. It just happens spontaneously, naturally. But you see, naturally, things don't go in that direction. Things go in precisely the opposite direction. As a matter of fact, if there is no God, or if God would not choose to intervene, this universe itself is absolutely certain to die. Because you see, in its natural state, at the present time, every star in the universe is burning up its fuel. Our own sun is burning up its fuel at the rate of billions of tons per second. Now it's quite obvious, is it not, that that fuel cannot last forever. Therefore, if there is no God, or if God would not intervene in this process, then the day will come, inevitably, when every star in the entire universe will have burned up its fuel. And then the lights will go out. Now there'll be no more activity anywhere in the universe. There'll be no life. Now the universe will still be here, quite obviously, but it'll be a dead universe. That is the absolute certain natural destiny of this universe. Now, the question I asked Dr. Asimov in the debate that we had, published in Science Digest, October 1981, I asked him this question. If the natural laws and the natural processes which now govern the universe are leading inevitably to its death and destruction, and if those natural laws and natural processes are all there is and all there ever has been, as he believes, then how could those very same natural laws and processes create the universe in the first place? Is it possible that the very processes which are destroying the universe could have been responsible for its origin? What sort of tortured logic would one have to use to reach such an impossible conclusion? This universe could not have created itself. The second law of thermodynamics, without exception, always applies to an isolated system. A system on which no work is being performed, nothing is being brought in from the outside. It's an isolated system. Everything that takes place within that system is a process of self-transformation. The second law of thermodynamics says that the system can go in one direction and one direction only, and that's downward. It will deteriorate. It will become less organized, less complex, less ordered. It will never, ever become more organized, more complex, more ordered. That will never happen. And yet evolutionists persist in believing that the universe started out in this state of chaos and disorder and the simplicity of hydrogen gas and transformed itself into the universe that we have today. Clearly a violation of the second law of thermodynamics. It is not physically possible for that to have happened. The creation science says that's irrational, it's unscientific. The universe is not an isolated system. There must be some external to it and independent of it who introduced a high degree of order and organization, complexity, and information found in the universe. Now let us leave this matter of thermodynamics and consider the probability of some of these things happening. You see, living things and the molecules that make up these living things are highly, precisely ordered and arranged, as you know that. The spacecraft that we put on Mars, incredibly complex spacecraft, millions of parts, precisely placed. Nothing was left to chance. The living cell makes such a craft seem very crude indeed. Life is incredibly complex. Certainly I learned that as a biochemist. Is it possible for something like this to have put itself together, a living cell, before there was no life? Now the evolutionists invoke natural selection and so forth, which many evolutionists are beginning to recognize as simply an impotent process. But before life, you could not have natural selection. Natural selection involved differential reproduction, and nothing reproduces itself except living organisms. So it all had to happen by chance. Is that possible? Well, here's a molecule. This is an enzyme. To get life started, you'd have to have hundreds of different kinds of enzymes. Enzymes are chemical reactions which make enzymes are protein molecules, for the most part, which make chemical reactions go very rapidly, which ordinarily would go slowly. In other words, they are catalysts. Absolutely essential for life. Now, here we see one of those enzymes, ribonuclease, one of the digestive enzymes. It has 124 of these amino acids, and we know that glycine is number one, followed by glutamic acid, then threonine, alanine, and 124 of these things arranged in precise order. No matter how complex machinery is, it won't work unless you turn it on. Now, we have this very, very, very highly complex molecule, just one of hundreds of molecules. necessary for life. Could this happen just by chance? Now, the evolution says it did happen by chance. That's all we got. Well, we can calculate the probability of that happening. It doesn't make any difference whether all those molecules had to go together instantaneously or whether you could arrange them sequentially. We have 20 different kinds of amino acids in proteins today. Now, there'd be many more on hypothetical primordial Earth, and there'd be left-handed and right-handed amino acids. Today, in protein, they're 100% left-handed. And there's absolutely no way to explain how that could take place. Chemistry cannot do that. Chemistry could not select the left-handed versus the right-handed. There's no possibility for chemistry to do that. But in protein today, the amino acids are all 100% left-handed. That is a result of deliberate choice, it seems to me. But let us say they were all left-handed. Let us say we only had these 20 amino acids. What would be the probability of, say, getting a protein like this by chance? 124 amino acids. The average protein has 400. Well, probability of lysine being number one is 1 chance out of 20. The probability of glutamic acid following lysine is obviously 1 over 20 times 1 over 20, 1 out of 400. The probability of lysine, glutamic acid, threonine is 1 over 20 times itself 3 times, which is 1 chance out of 8,000. The first 4, 1 chance out of 160,000. The first 5, 1 chance out of 3,200,000. The probability of having those 6 arranged in that order is 1 chance out of 64 million. What is the probability that we're going to have 124 amino acids arranged precisely in that fashion? 1 over 20 times itself 124 times. Ladies and gentlemen, I assure you that would never happen on this earth in 5 billion years. Even if you could put 124 of those amino acids together 1 trillion times a second for 5 billion years, the probability that you'd reach that particular arrangement is essentially nil. The probability is so long. Let me illustrate something simple. If I'd have 17 people line up here in front of the auditorium, and then to rearrange themselves in a different order, and keep doing that time after time after time, 17 people could line up in over 355 trillion different ways. 355 trillion different ways. And if you don't believe me, after the meeting, you get 16 of your friends together and you try. Yes. If I wrote their name down on a piece of paper, they would have only 1 chance out of 355 trillion of lining up the way I'd written their names down on the paper. That's only 17. Or we have 124. The average protein, 400. And what if it did happen? What would you have? 1 single molecule of 1 single protein. But to get life started, in an ocean containing 350 million cubic miles of water, you'd have to have billions of tons, each of hundreds of different kinds of protein molecules. You'd have to have billions of tons each of hundreds of different kinds of DNA and RNA molecules and complex carbohydrates. That is not going to happen on this planet under any circumstances. And even if you did have that happen, you still would not get a living cell. Because you see, a living cell is just not a bag of chemicals. You've got to have membrane, which is very complex structures. You've got to have energy factories, protein factories, genetic material, and it all has to be put together, just like the mechanism you watch. They're going to happen by chance? Not in trillions of years. It would never happen by chance. Here we have a newspaper article appeared in a London newspaper, the Daily Express, August 14, 1981. 2 skeptical scientists put their heads together and reached an amazing conclusion. There must be a God. Who were these 2 scientists? One was Sir Fred Hoyle, famous British astronomer, the world's foremost astronomer, and his friend, Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe, also a well-known British astronomer. They became interested in the problem of the origin of life a number of years ago. They made some assumptions about the minimum quantity of material to get life started. Then they calculated the probability of that happening somewhere in the universe, assuming that every star in the entire universe had a planet like the Earth, and that the universe was 20 billion years old. The answer came back, forget about it. The probability was so low it was essentially nil. Sir Fred said the probability of evolution is equal to the probability that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard would assemble a Boeing 747. I tell people, if you want to believe that, that's your business, but don't call that science and don't teach it to your students. Now, these two scientists were atheists when they began these studies. They were totally committed to an evolutionary, naturalistic, mechanistic origin of life, the origin of the universe, and the origin of living organism. They concluded that the evolutionary origin of life was a physical impossibility. Therefore, it had to be created supernaturally, therefore there must be a God. They certainly did not become creationists because of their religion, did they? They became creationists in spite of their religion. They do not believe the Bible, they don't believe the book of Genesis, but they do believe that wherever life exists, it had to be created. I've written many articles on that subject, books, and spoken on that subject for many, many years, and I'm certainly delighted to have such a famous scientist as this Sir Fred Hoyle now to agree to the conclusions I had reached many years ago. And I find that more and more origin of life chemists are becoming very discouraged today. 20 and 30 years ago, they thought, well, just in a few years now, we'll solve these problems, we'll know how this happened, we can do this, and we can do that, and they can't. And they're saying that these experiments, which are nothing more than really exercises in organic chemistry, either lead into a blind alley or are simply irrelevant. Ladies and gentlemen, what we know, the science that we know, the proven principles of science, shows that life could not have arisen spontaneously. What we do know, what we have demonstrated, what we have proven by science, shows beyond doubt that life could not have evolved spontaneously on this planet, and it could not have created itself naturally. It had to be created supernaturally. Now let's take a look at the fossil record. We've been discussing whether evolution could happen. Let's see if it did happen. Let's double check. Let's look at the fossil record. Life supposedly began with some little microscopic organism. The evolution say billions of years ago. And this little microscopic organism evolved into everything living today that has ever lived on this earth. Over several billion years. Now if that's true, I think you would agree that our museum should have huge numbers of transition forms. Just think, billions times billions of those intermediate forms. Those transitional types would have lived and died during those many hundreds of millions of years. We have 250,000 different fossil species in our museum today. And if evolution is true, tens of thousands of those things should be of intermediate form, transition form, showing, for example, fins changing into feet and legs, scales changing into feathers, forelimbs into wings, apes into people, if evolution is true. On the other hand, if creation is true, we expect the fossil record to show that each basic type of organism appeared abruptly, fully formed. Onions have always been onions, roses have always been roses, tigers have always been tigers, clans have always been clans, people have always been people. Yes, limited variation within the limits of each kind. Many races of people, many varieties of finches that Darwin recognized in the Galapagos Islands. But they were not only still birds, they were still finches, you see. And we have many varieties of dogs. And the dog, Canis familiaris, will interbreed and produces fertile offspring with wolves and coyotes and jackals, all within the family Canis, or the genus Canis. They are infertile. They produce fertile offspring. So we believe they have come from one created kind, which God gave sufficient genetic variability potential to vary in a limited way so it could adapt to various environments and various conditions around the earth. But there is no evidence that cats and dogs came from a common ancestor, you see. Or that tigers and hippopotamuses came from a common ancestor, or apes and man came from a common ancestor. Each basic type was separately and distinctly created. That means the creation scientist would not expect to find its intermediate form. He would predict that they would not exist. Let's look at the fossil record. Here on this slide, this is the reconstruction of animals whose fossils are found in so-called Cambrian rocks. Evolutionists believe these Cambrian rocks began to form 600 million years ago. They take all the Cambrian rocks all around the world and total them all up, and they take 80 million years for all those rocks to form. A little fraction of an inch of sediment per year, accumulating. Now they are called Cambrian rocks by the kind of fossils that are found in them. That's the way they're identified as Cambrian rock. Now first of all, I just don't have the foggiest notion how you get fossils under those conditions. An animal that dies and lies out on the ground, floats around the water, is just not going to sit there for hundreds and thousands of years waiting to get buried, and so it becomes a fossil. It's just simply destroyed. Oxidation, bacterial decomposition, and so forth destroys everything. Yet we have billions times billions of these fossils. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of fossil fishes and many other creatures. It seems to me to speak of a catastrophic burial rather than this very slow accumulation. But however they got there, whenever they got there, we have fossils of the sponges and the jellyfish and the sea urchins and trilobites were incredibly complex creatures, and the sea lilies and the swimming crustacean Cydia, brachiopods and worms, and clams and snails, an amazing, utterly amazing array of very complicated invertebrates. These are only a few. An invertebrate, of course, is a creature that does not have an internal skeleton or backbone. But these are very complicated creatures. Now, underneath these Cambrian rocks, generally underneath, are what we call pre-Cambrian rocks. Evolutionists believe that these pre-Cambrian rocks were laid down during the hundreds of millions of years before the Cambrian. Many of them are undisturbed, perfectly suitable for the preservation of fossils. And if these creatures evolved from that little microscopic organism, then those pre-Cambrian rocks should have billions times billions of fossils of the intermediate forms. Now, in those pre-Cambrian rocks, we find fossils of little microscopic single-cell organisms, bacteria and algae. I think you will agree, ladies and gentlemen, that we can find fossils of little microscopic organisms. We can certainly find fossils of everything between those creatures and these creatures, if they evolved into these creatures. Let me say this, and there is absolutely no refutation of this, there's no quarrel, there's no dispute. Nowhere on the face of this earth have we found any fossils of ancestors that are ancestral to these creatures. We have never found fossils that are ancestral to jellyfish, or sponges, or sea urchins, or trilobites, or clams, or snails. Nothing like that has been found nowhere on the face of this earth. The so-called ediacaran fauna, found first in Australia and other places around the world. Those animals are now recognized to be so completely different from these animals, they could not be the ancestors. Ladies and gentlemen, evolution has not taken place on this planet. We have this vast array of incredibly complex invertebrates. Billions times billions of their fossils are available, but not one single ancestor. These invertebrates appear abruptly fully formed. That is what the empirical scientific evidence has demonstrated, whether you believe it or not. That's up to you. But the evidence is clear. Now, furthermore, one of these invertebrates supposedly gave rise to the vertebrates. Fishes are supposed to be the first vertebrates. They have an internal skeleton. They have a backbone, just like you and me. Evolutionists believe it took 100 million years for several of these invertebrates to evolve into the fishes. 100 million years of evolution. Now we have billions times billions of these creatures, probably times billions again, the fossils. We have hundreds of millions of fossil fishes. And if one evolved into the other during 100 million years, we should have billions times billions of the fossils of the intermediate form. And our museums should have millions and millions and millions of those fossils. As a matter of fact, they don't have one. Not even one. Nowhere on the face of this earth, ladies and gentlemen, has anyone ever found fossils ancestral to any of the major type of fishes. Every major kind of fish that we know anything about has had its origins firmly based in nothing. And ladies and gentlemen, I mean nothing. Absolutely nothing. Now, ladies and gentlemen, evolution, absolutely, you see, it is not possible. It is not physically possible to have 100 million years of evolution, whereby some invertebrate evolved into the fishes. During that time, there'd be an immense population of these creatures. It would be physically impossible for that 100 million years of evolution to take place and not produce one single fossil. It is not possible. Evolution did not take place, ladies and gentlemen. We don't have to talk about anything else. We don't have to talk about Lucy, really, or Archaeopteryx, or the horses. We don't have to talk about anything else. We have established beyond doubt that evolution has not taken place. And no paleontologist that I'm aware of will get up and argue with what I said. That is, as far as the record itself is concerned, they have no record of any evolution leading to the fishes. That settles the matter. But we like to talk about some other things. We like to talk about dinosaurs. Dinosaur fossils are found all around the world, on every continent, from the North Shore of Alaska down to Antarctica. And boy, the evolutionists have really a lot of fun trying to explain how you could have dinosaurs up on the North Shore of Alaska, and they believe Alaska was even farther north than that when those dinosaurs existed, or down in Antarctica. But there they are. And we have fossils of the Triceratops, has 3 horns and a huge armor shield. And we have a different kind of a dinosaur, Stegosaurus, no horns on the head, but 3 spikes or 4 spikes on the tail, with long, very unusual plates along the back. You see those spikes about 3 feet long, very substantial structure, as are the plates. If they evolve, we should have a whole series of intermediate forms showing the gradual formation of those things. And then we have the duck-billed dinosaurs, the crocodile here, standing 18 feet high. We see the amazing duck-bill of this creature. And there are many different kinds of duck-billed dinosaurs, old bonehead, Coryphosaurus. They did have teeth, as you notice, but they had this very strange duck-bill. And the Pterosaurolophus, many of them had this very unusual structures on the head, all had the duck-bill. And supposedly jaws and teeth gradually evolved into these duck bills. You think we'd have thousands and thousands of the intermediate forms. We don't have even one. Now on this slide here, oh wait a minute, I don't know what that's, I didn't intend to show that slide, ladies and gentlemen. That's not a dumb's but picture my grandson. And then we have the Tyrannosaurus rex, with jaws about 6 feet long, and teeth about 6 inches long. No wonder they call them terrible lizards, those ferocious teeth. Then we have the Diplodocus, one of these large plant-eating dinosaurs, about 100 feet long. We see the man standing in front of this huge creature. The great Brontosaurus, we're supposed to call him the Patasaurus, but I like the name Brontosaurus. It means thunder lizard. Weighed about 40 tons. The ground must have thundered, you see, when he went by. About 75 to 80 feet long. Then we have the largest one of all, the great Brachiosaurus, standing as high as a 5-story building, weighing up to 100 tons or 200,000 pounds, and his nostrils were not located out on the end of the snout, but in that bony dome on the top of the head. No scientist has ever been able to figure out why he had that strange arrangement. One thing we do know, we've never found one single transition form showing the nostrils gradually migrating into the bony dome on the top of the head. Nothing like that has ever been found. We have no transitional form for these creatures. You can find duck-billed dinosaurs, horned dinosaurs, Stegosaurus, and all of that in your museum, but you will not find transitional form. But what about the origin of man? Well, evolutionists believe something like this must have taken place. You see, we go from an ape-like creature to man. They postulate that there's some common ancestor of ape and man. They've never found him yet. But they postulate there was this common ancestor, which gave rise to modern apes. Another line gave rise to man. So they're looking for those intermediates. They found what they believe possibly represents some intermediate form. Australopithecines. The Australopithecines first discovered in 1924 in South Africa. This is a skull discovered by Dr. Louis Leakey and his wife Mary in East Africa in 1959. You see it's grossly ape-like, no forehead, very flat skull, the bony ridge on top of the skull, massive eyebrow ridges, very typical of the ape. But it was claimed that the teeth were somewhat man-like, and it's been claimed that these creatures walked upright in the human manner. More lately, Dr. Donald Johansen found a series of these creatures which he called Australopithecus afarensis. One was of a female, about 40% complete. He named her Lucy, and he became world famous overnight because he claimed that although Lucy was essentially ate from the neck up, she walked upright like you and me. Here we see the actual skull of Lucy. This is a reconstruction of the skull. And they said when they reconstructed it, it looked like a small female gorilla. But nevertheless, it walked upright. And that's a generally accepted view. Time-life publications or textbooks and so forth. But there's some scientists who do not believe it. And these scientists are not creationists. One of them, Lord Zuckerman, very famous British anatomist who had a scientific team that spent 15 years studying these creatures. And he studied fossils of these creatures that were supposed to be 1 to 2 million years younger than Lucy, therefore more recent in time, therefore they should be more man-like. He said his research shows that they did not walk upright, they are not intermediate between ape and man, and they are not our ancestors. Dr. Charles Oxnard, professor of anatomy, University of Southern California, studied the post-cranial skeleton of these creatures for many years using the most sophisticated methods of analyses available, studying their foot bones, their leg bones, knee joints, pelvis, and so forth. And he has declared that his research shows that these creatures were not intermediate between ape and man. They did not walk upright, and they are certainly not our ancestors. I'm certain that Lucy is going to be kicked out of the family tree of man in a few more years. They've suffered the same fate of some other creatures. Here's Piltdown Man. Turned out to be a fake. A fraud. Somebody had taken a job on an ape, a human skull, treated with chemicals, make them with gold, planted the bones in a gravel pit, and fooled the greatest authorities for nearly half a century, until a chemist exposed the hoax. And then we had a Nebraska man, a single tooth found in western Nebraska, and they were very excited about the discovery of this tooth. They thought it had characteristics intermediate between ape and man. And they called this creature Nebraska Man. And here's a 1922 picture of a Nebraska Man based upon the description of those scientists published in the Illustrated London News. Here we see Nebraska Man, we see his wife, we see the tools that they were using, all based upon that one single tooth. Science is a fascinating subject, isn't it? Well, a few years later, they found some additional remains of this creature. He turned out to be neither an ape-like man or a man-like ape. It turned out to be a pig. That's right. It was nothing more than a pig's tooth. And pardon me for saying so, ladies and gentlemen, but I think this is the case where an evolutionist made a man out of the pig, and the pig made a monkey out of the evolution. But you see, they thought they were seeing something, both in the Piltdown Man and in the Nebraska Man, because they wanted to see it, because they expected to see it. And then we have Ramapithecus. This is a reconstruction of Ramapithecus from the San Diego Museum of Man, which was put there a few years ago. Well, Ramapithecus, when they found additional material, were able to get an accurate reconstruction, turned out to be an orangutan, essentially an orangutan. You want to know what Ramapithecus really looked like? Well, that's the skull of an orangutan. That's what he really looked like. Didn't look like the reverse at all. That's what they said he looked like, but really, that's what it's called. He looked like, you see. And then we have the Neanderthal people. Here's the Neanderthal man, and this is the way he was viewed for nearly a century. Neanderthal people, very crude subhuman ancestors of humans, Homo neanderthalensis. But it was discovered that these creatures suffered from pathological conditions, arthritis, vitamin D deficiency, or rickets, which causes the bones to become soft and deformed. And finally today they have upgraded Neanderthal man to Homo sapiens. And here's a modern view of Neanderthal man. The Neanderthal people were human. They were humans like you and me, but very similar. They were, at least they were human, not our subhuman ancestors at all. Now, what I'm saying, we've got to be very cautious. We accept what these people are saying. If somebody comes to me about Lucy, I say, okay, let's just wait 50 years from now. Let's see what happens to Lucy. Where she is 50 years from now, I'm predicting she'll be down at the base of the family tree and not in the family tree. Now, finally, I want to illustrate a challenge that I've given to evolutionists many times. I'm going to challenge Dr. Fisher to explain this based upon evolution theory. And that is metamorphosis. And I'm going to use the monarch butterfly to illustrate the process of metamorphosis. Here we have the adult monarch butterfly. And as you know, the female lays egg. Here we see the newly laid egg and the developing egg. And then the caterpillar is hatched. And this caterpillar crawls, has mouth parts for eating leaves, has a very dull way of life, crawls around, eats leaves, crawls around, eats leaves, crawls around, eats leaves. Goes through several molts, and apparently he had some urge to hang glide or something. And he saw all these beautiful things flying around, decided he wanted to fly. Now he knew there's nothing in a caterpillar to recommend him to be a butterfly or something like that. And so he had a brilliant idea, apparently, according to evolution. You're going to go right back down to ground zero and start all over again. And then we see what happened. Here he is. He attaches himself to a leaf, starts to curl his head up this way, and then he makes one last blow, kicks off that exoskeleton, and you know what happens? Here's the miracle in itself. A miracle in itself. A miracle of engineering. The chrysalis, the cocoon. Here he is now nothing more than a mass of jelly. And now he's got a great big problem. How do you convert a mass of jelly into a butterfly? How would that happen? Step by step by step. Start with a caterpillar, with all those legs and the mouth part for chewing leaves, through a series of genetic mistakes. Now, these mutations are genetic error, genetic mistakes, step by step, convert a caterpillar into a butterfly. How could you do that? How could that happen by evolution?
Well, it does happen actually today. We see the caterpillar developing in the chrysalis, and then we see emerging from the cocoon, and he's pumping the fluid from his fat tummy into the wings, through these veins here, the wings slipping out and drying, and then we have the adult butterfly.
Now there certainly is a miracle, an engineering miracle. One of the Time Life publications describes this process. He called it miraculous. He said we have no idea how this process could take place. Now I maintain there is no explanation evolutionary-wise for that. I was at the University of California at Davis last year lecturing, and this subject came up, and one of the lecturers turned up into the audience and said, well, Dr. Shapiro is here. Maybe he could explain that. Dr. Shapiro is the acting head of the zoology department at that university. His field of expertise is butterflies. He goes to South America every year to study butterflies. Well, Dr. Shapiro said this. He says, well, now, actually, instead of, we believe, rather than the caterpillar coming first and then the butterfly later, we believe the butterfly came first and then the caterpillar. And then he smiled. He said, look, he said, we don't have any explanation for that either. Well, they don't have any explanation for the process either. It doesn't make a difference whether you start out with a caterpillar, you assume you tried a caterpillar first and then had to evolve into a butterfly, or you went from the egg to the butterfly, and then the butterfly somehow had to evolve this intermediate process of producing the caterpillar and that chrysalis, reducing itself to a mass of jelly, you see, and so forth and so on. Going back to the caterpillar, I guess, I don't know. But there is just no explanation for this. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, there's much else we could discuss. I would say this. The theory of embryological recapitulation, the idea that the human embryo recapitulates its evolutionary ancestry, that it looks like a fish with gill slits, and then a tadpole, and then a reptile, and an ape and man, that is a thoroughly discredited theory. Evolutionists, knowledgeable embryologists no longer believe it. They proclaim it to be false. The human embryo never has gills, and it never has slits. And if it never has gills, it never has slits. One thing is certain, it never has gill slits. Now that's for certain. And there's no recapitulation whatsoever. A number of years I was debating Ashley Montague at Princeton University. I made that statement, and he said yes. He says that's true. And no evolutionist should ever use that discredited theory to support evolution. And we see it in our textbook all the time. High school textbook, college textbooks, and otherwise. And then the fact of homology. Similar structures in different animals. What is evidence for evolution? Could you find a better evidence for evolution? The fact that different animals have similar structures must have been inherited from a common ancestor? Well, ladies and gentlemen, the scientific evidence is absolutely contradictory to the notion that these similar structures in different animals exist because they have been inherited from a common ancestor. Sir Gavin de Beer, the British biologist, And evolution is called homology, an unsolved problem, because the evidence is so contradictory. Finally, do I have a minute left? 1 minute. The idea of vestigial organs, the idea that the little leftover useful structures in man inherited from our evolutionary ancestors is thoroughly discredited. All of these so-called vestigial organs have now been shown to have a function, including our tonsils, our appendix, our tailbone, our coccyx, our pituitary gland, thymus gland, and things like that. All of this so-called evidence for evolution turns out to be marvelous evidence for the master creator. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe from all the evidence available, natural laws and natural processes now operating in the universe, from all the laws of probability, from the fossil record itself, and all from biology and genetics and so forth, I believe the best statement that we can make today concerning our origins is still, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Thank you very much.
I'm sure that you all enjoy listening to, or you used to enjoy listening to Ronald Reagan give a State of the Union message. I wonder how many of you listened to Tip O'Neill afterwards. I'm sure you enjoy listening to President Bush give his State of the Union message. I wonder how many listened to Tom Foley afterwards. You need to listen to both sides in order to understand it. So 1 minute, and hopefully that's not enough time to get too many people gone too far.
I tell you, that is one tough act to follow. The problem is that we're really talking about different things from different perspectives. I guess I better start off by mentioning the newspaper article today, which I'm sure most of you saw, and which I thought was an excellent article. There's just one point in it I wanted to contradict. In the article, because of what the reporter said between both of our statements, Dr. Gish is quoted as saying that I must be very arrogant. And that's one thing I cannot plead guilty to. No scientist talking about the origin of the universe, or the origin of life, can be arrogant, because we don't have the answers. And that's a very important point I want to make right up front. It makes it very difficult for me to win any debate like this, because the creationists come out and tell you a very simple story about origins. The Creator created us. Usually don't say God created us, because that would make it a religious argument, and they want to stay away from religion. So they use the word creator instead, and somehow that makes it scientific. I don't quite follow that logic. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of logic I don't follow in what Dr. Gish said. I enjoyed it, but I don't really understand it. I started making notes about the parts I didn't understand. I gave up after the first 5 minutes. If I get a chance, I'd like to go over some of these things point by point. Because what Dr. Gish is doing, what the creationists are doing, is using scientific language, but not science. What they're telling you that the evolutionists say is not quite wrong. It's also not quite right. It makes it very difficult to pick apart. He's not saying stupid things, and he's not telling lies, but also what he's not telling is the truth. Let me just take one point before I get started. Dr. Gish talked a lot about the second law of thermodynamics, which says that everything in the universe tends to disorder. Now this is true. And he uses this to argue against evolution. And this is not quite true, because the evolutionists are scientists. And the second law of thermodynamics is known to every scientist. And if the second law of thermodynamics truly contradicted evolution, then no scientist worth the name could still be an evolutionist. The second law of thermodynamics does say everything runs to disorder. But that does not contradict evolution. Because within any given system, small parts can become more and more ordered. And I'll give you a simple experiment you can do to test this for yourself. You just take some salt and sprinkle it into a bowl of water and mix it up, and it will dissolve. Now you cannot tell where within that bowl of water any one of these salt ions is. It is a totally disordered system. And you take that bowl of water and put it outside overnight. And you let it sit there for a day or a night. It may take 1 or 2 or 3 days, depending how much water you've got. And what's going to happen is the water is going to evaporate. And what you're going to be left with are salt crystals. Very highly ordered salt crystals. That system has gone from a disordered state to an ordered state. And it did not take the finger of God. It did not take the finger of a creator to do it. The same thing applies to life evolving on Earth. If you should find a planet out in the void, totally apart from any sun, from any source of energy, and if life were to originate on that planet, that would be a miracle. That would contradict the second law of thermodynamics. That would contradict evolutionary theory, and we would all throw evolution away. But on this planet, life orders itself because it is fed with energy from the sun. As the sun throws out photons of light, they go from this very dense state inside the sun, spreading out all over the solar system. They become very disordered. The overall state of the solar system is to become more and more disordered as the sun spreads its light out. But within that disordered set, a subset can become more and more ordered. Life can grow without violating the second law of thermodynamics. This does not prove that it's true. It doesn't prove that's the way it happened. I say this only to show to you that evolutionary theory does not contradict the second law of thermodynamics. Dr. Gish showed you Asimov's statement of the second law of thermodynamics. Asimov understands that law. Asimov is an evolutionist. If the second law contradicted evolutionary theory, Asimov could not possibly be an evolutionist. So these kinds of statements are just twisted sorts of logic, which don't take us anywhere. I have to argue against the arrogance label on another level entirely. Not on the basis of all of science, but on my basis in particular. I am not a biologist. I can lay no claim to being an evolutionist. I have done no research which supports or describes evolutionary theory in any way. There is much about all of this that I simply know nothing about. And I have to apologize to you, I cannot answer all these arguments. Science has learned so much in the past couple of thousand years that no scientist knows all of science. And so no scientist could possibly answer all different arguments from all different aspects of creation. My own work has to do with the creation of the Earth, the creation of the solar system, and I'll try to keep my remarks to that. I must apologize on one last point. When you come to a debate, you are entitled to expect what our moderator described at the beginning. two sides come together to debate two different sides of the question, and both sides are roughly equally viable. In fact, he says he often has his students choose one side or the other, or be assigned one side or the other, and they're expected to argue equally both sides of the question. We don't have that here. I apologize, I'm sorry, but we simply do not have that here. The overwhelming majority of all scientists simply reject the creationist arguments as totally flawed. There is no meeting ground. That's the bad news. The good news is that you do not have to reject the notion of a creator, even of God, if you accept the evolutionary ideas. Dr. Gish says the evolutionists throw out God from the story. They exclude him in his work. This is not true. There is absolutely no reason why God should not have chosen the mechanism of evolution to create the different forms of life. It's a perfectly reasonable way. It's a very straightforward way of going about things. The point is that science simply does not talk about God, a creator, or anything supernatural. Not because science denies this, but simply because it is beyond the realm of science to deal with. We know nothing about it. Dr. Gish also made the point that the reason we're here tonight is to debate which of the two, creationism or science, gives the truth. I can't debate that. No scientist can ever claim he knows the truth. Science is not a theory of the truth. Science is a method of trying to find out what the truth is. And we've been at it for a few hundred years now. And we know enough about it to know that you never know when you've got the truth. The best we can do is to get a little bit closer and closer to the truth. This is the glory of science and the weakness. In no sense can I come up and tell you I know the truth about the origin of the universe, or about the origin of life, or about the origin of anything else. What I can tell you is that if you want to know the truth, the best bet you've got is the scientific method. And the reason for this is that every step along the way, science tests itself. You can never prove an idea is right, but you can frequently test it to see if it's wrong. And this is what science does. And whenever we find it's wrong, we throw it out, or modify it, and start again. And so we're starting here, and we want to get to the truth, and we just go wandering back and forth. But each time we come up against a false idea, we reject it and start over again. Little by little, we get closer to the truth. And it works. We know it works because we know we are making progress. When I was a kid, my parents were terrified every summer when polio season came along. They saw other children locked in iron lungs for the rest of their life. They wouldn't let me go to the movies, they wouldn't let me swim in swimming pools. Every time I got a summer cold and a little fever, they were terrified. All parents were terrified. Because this was a horrible disease and we didn't know where it came from, we didn't know how it was spread, we didn't know where it would strike next. And then all of a sudden, there was a visit to the doctor and a quick pinprick of pain. And within a year or two, not even that, a little sugar cube, and polio was gone. It used to be that people would take months to try to cross the ocean, and most of them would die doing it. And now we fly back and forth in a few hours. We know we're making progress. We know the method works. Not only that, but it's the only method that works. the only method we know of. Tomorrow somebody may come up with something a lot better. But today it's the only method that works. There are other methods of trying to determine the truth, but none of them have shown any progress. Only the scientific method has given us clearly identifiable progress. Religion is one path people take to the truth. And it may very well be true, but we don't know this, and we haven't made much progress. Religion has not changed much in the past 1,000 years. It may be because it's perfect from the start, but the one thing it is not doing is progressing. Artistic vision is another pathway to the truth. Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That's all you know on earth and all you need to know. Well, I want to know a lot more than that. And I know that the people writing plays today, although they're damn good plays, some of them, they're not better than Shakespeare's. They haven't been making progress. The poets writing today are not writing better poetry than Shelley and Keats did. And I know for damn sure the people playing music today aren't writing better music than Beethoven. The only method that we know works in the sense of getting further along is the scientific method. And that's because it continually tests itself. And this is a point that is very important in discussing evolutionists and their feelings and all these slides Dr. Gish was showing you. The whole concept of science is to continually test itself, to not believe anything you're told. We're told that evolution is dogma, that it's fact. The word I want to come out to describe that is so impolite I can't use it. It's nonsense. This is not the way any scientist worth his salt looks upon any theory or any law or even any experiment. Scientists, by their nature, don't believe anything they're told. I was a terrible trial to my mother because of this. Anytime you're told, this is so, the scientist's reaction is, how the hell do you know? Let's try to prove that it isn't so. And if I can't prove it isn't so, and if 1,000 other people can't prove it isn't so, then very grudgingly I say, well, okay, maybe it is so, but I'm going to keep on thinking. There isn't a biologist worth his salt who doesn't want to disprove the theory of evolution. Instant Nobel Prize. Instant fame. I mean, that's what the game is about, isn't it? Nobody goes and says, this is dogma, I will believe it. There's no catechism in science. Let me try to describe to you how science works and the philosophy behind it. And I'll try to use the things I'm more knowledgeable about, the creation of the universe, the creation of the earth, just to give you an idea of how it works. The problem I'm up against is that this is the sort of thing I do all the time to my students, but I teach them for a year in basic physics and a year in basic chemistry, and then more mathematics, and then more geology, and finally, after 4 years of college, as a science major, they're ready to begin to learn something. And then they take more years of courses in graduate school. And finally they get a PhD, and then they're ready to begin to learn something. When I started graduate school, I was very excited. I thought in another 4 or 5 years, I'm going to have my PhD, and I'll be a scientist. I will know science. And those 4 years went by, and I suddenly got my PhD, and I was terrified. Because I thought I didn't know anything. Now here in 45 minutes, I'm going to try to tell you how science works and what we know about creation. It's obviously impossible. if you're serious about trying to learn some of this, you must try to educate yourself more than listening to a couple of fast-talking demagogues tell you what they think about things. You've got to read books, if possible, go back and take some courses at the local university. I have thoughtfully remembered to bring along some books which you might find interesting, and they're out there or in your library. So let me try to give you some rough idea of what we're talking about. Up to the beginning of this century, we had absolutely no idea scientifically how the universe came about. In fact, let me take you for a moment a couple of thousand years back further than that. Go back in time some 10,000 years. What were we? Naked, ignorant savages. We knew nothing at all. We look out and we see the sun, and it's giving us warmth, and it lets us see. And then the sun goes down, and it gets cold, and it gets dark, and we're terrified. And we have no idea if that sun is ever going to come up again. The concept of science arose when people tried to find out what was going on. And we now know that the Earth moves around the sun and spins on its axis, and this is not going to stop tonight. I don't think any of us are consciously worried that tomorrow morning is not going to come. We know this because we've learned a lot about science. We don't know everything. And there is a feeling sometimes for people to reject what we say about science because we don't know everything. If we try to tell you we know everything, we're bluffing and we get caught out. And if we say we don't know everything, the feeling is, well, let's turn to someone who does know everything. But we do know something. We have made some progress in science. We can't cure malaria. We can't prevent sleeping sickness or AIDS. But we can prevent polio. We can cure a lot of things. We can't go to the stars. We have no idea how to go to the stars. We may never be able to go to the stars. But we can go across the oceans back and forth in a few hours. And we've been to the moon, and we've sent rockets to Mars and Venus and Jupiter. So we've made progress. We can do something. We do know something. The same thing applies to the origins. We know something. We know a rough idea of how things came about. We don't know exactly. We cannot say there was no creator. This is not an argument between whether or not there was a creator. The argument is about what came afterwards. We don't know how the universe began, if you want to define that as going back to before the beginning and saying how it came about. There is nothing in science that can tell you that. But Dr. Gish's statement that because all this happened in the past, we can say nothing about it, is a nonsensical statement. We do this all the time in all forms of activity. When a dead body is discovered, a body with its throat slit, we do not say, well, nobody was here at the time and therefore we will never solve the crime. We frequently solve the crime. You put together facts and it leads to a coherent theory. And it is sufficient sometimes to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, you never know whether that verdict is true or false. And people have been convicted when they were innocent. You don't like to believe it, but it's certainly true. And certainly people go off innocent when they are in reality guilty. But if we stick to the criterion of proven beyond a reasonable doubt, this is as much as science can give you. This is as much as you can ask. And if it's good enough to convict people to death, I think it's good enough to say, at least we have a reasonable idea. We may not be sure, but we have a reasonable idea. So come into this century, what do we know about the universe? We learned at the beginning of the century that all the galaxies were expanding away from each other. And they're expanding at speeds such that the furthest ones away are moving the fastest. This was our first clue, our very first clue to the origin of the universe. Because what this looks like is an explosion. If you have a briefcase with a bomb in it, and you put it on an airplane, as people do these days, and it blows up, as it frequently happens. If you took a snapshot of that, a microsecond after the explosion, you'd find pieces flying in all directions, and the pieces furthest away would be moving the fastest. So we simply argue by analogy, that's what the universe looks like. Perhaps it all began in a giant explosion. And as soon as we said that, somebody else said, nah, must be another explanation. And they came up with another explanation. They came up with the theory of the steady-state universe. They said perhaps there never was this explosion at all. Perhaps the universe always existed. And that's a very tough concept to come to terms with. No beginning at all. Always existed. But if it always existed, and it is continually expanding, then any given block of the universe must eventually become empty, because everything will expand out. So they came around to this by saying there must be continual creation of matter. And little bits and pieces of matter are created to fill in, to keep the universe full, even though it's continually expanding. This seemed to violate the law of conservation of mass. But they were able to prove that the amounts of matter necessary were so little that it didn't violate what we really knew about the law of conservation of mass. So by the 1950s, we had these two different theories about the creation of the universe. We didn't know which they were. One, the Big Bang, the other, the steady state. And then we got one experimental point. Let me see if I can operate this thing. Some people doing experiments with radio satellites. That's fine, thank you. Found that they got some stuff. Can you hear me? You care? This is all right, you can't hear me? They were trying to communicate with the satellite, and they got a little bit of radiation that they couldn't account for. If we plot it on a graph, it'll look like this. We plot the intensity of the radiation versus the wavelength, and they got a point, let's say right there. Nobody knew what it was. Nobody knew where it was coming from. It was coming from empty space, not from stars, but simply from empty space. And then someone came up with an idea. He said, suppose we did have a Big Bang. Then what we had was a tremendous burst of energy and heat. And the universe since then has been cooling down. And the radiation from that Big Bang should still be around. They were able to calculate what form it would take on this kind of graph. And the form looked something like this. There was that one point. So what they suggested was that one point was evidence of the Big Bang. Well, immediately everybody said, no, there must be some other explanation. So they tried to get different points on the curve. Now the problem was the area here is all absorbed by the atmosphere. So the radiation coming in is absorbed by the atmosphere. So they looked down here, and they found a point down here, and another one up here, and another one up here, and another one up here. And it was all falling right along the predicted line. But people kept coming up with other ideas that would explain it in addition. And finally, we were able to send up rockets rockets above the atmosphere and looked at the radiation coming in, and we got points here and here and here and here, all along the line. It's an absolutely perfect fit. This is the evidence that we say constitutes our reason for supposing that the universe began in a Big Bang. It's a perfect fit of experiment with theory. And nobody has a decent alternative theory to explain it. That is, nobody else can explain the shape of these points except as the leftover material from the Big Bang. So for this reason, we accept that the universe began in a Big Bang. Now maybe tomorrow, somebody else will come up with another idea that will explain these points just as well. We are not going to throw away that idea because this is dogma. Quite the contrary. Every astrophysicist will jump on that idea and find some difference between the two theories that can be tested. And then we'll test it, and somebody will win a Nobel Prize. That's the way science works. Always testing, always questioning. The idea that we accept dogma is simply not the way science works. Let me give you a picture of how evolutionary theory can be tested. Because one of the claims of the creationists is that evolution is only a theory, has never been tested. Let me say a word or two about this argument, quote, only a theory. This is a misunderstanding of how scientists use the word theory. The popular misunderstanding is that a law is established fact, and a theory is somebody's idea that may or may not be true. This is not what the words mean. As an example, let me talk about gravity and Einstein's theory of relativity. You all remember Newton's law of gravity. It tells us that if you step off the building, you're going to fall down. You're not going to fall off. What the law of gravity really is simply a concise statement which covers a whole bunch of observations. Newton did not invent the law of gravity because he thought it was a keen idea. He came up with the idea because for centuries we have known that everything falls down. And what he came up with is simply a very concise statement that there is a force between the earth and us, and if we step off into space, that force will suck us down into the earth. Einstein's theory of gravity, theory of relativity, his general theory, is in essence a theory of gravity. And what it says is that Newton's law is wrong. But that's a bad way to phrase it. It's very difficult to find the proper ways without using the mathematics. What Einstein's theory says is that the attractive, what looks like an attractive force between two bodies, is really due to the curvature of space. And we interpret it as a force. Really, it's curvature. The difference between Newton's law and Einstein's theory is twofold. One, Newton's law is very simple and concise. This is a characteristic of what we call laws. You can usually state them in one sentence. Law of conservation of mass, mass is neither created nor destroyed. Law of gravity, attractive force between two bodies. Einstein's theory of evolution is immensely complex. It takes pages and pages of pure mathematical notation, let alone words, to describe it. This is why it is called a theory. Not because it is less correct than Newton, not because it is less proven than Newton, but because it is more complex. It involves more notions, more observations, more ideas. And in fact, Einstein's theory is much more nearly correct than Newton's law. We know that Newton's law is not precise. It's a good law. It is good enough for us to send rockets to the moon, for example. But it cannot explain quasars or black holes or the motion of Mercury. Einstein's theory of gravity can explain all these things. It has been extensively tested, and it has answered the tests in every single case. There is not a single experimental refutation of Einstein's theory. Nobody says, let's call it Einstein's law, because it's too complex to be a law. And so the idea that evolution is only a theory, with the implication that it hasn't been proven, is not true. It's simply too complex to be called a law. And there are many different aspects of it. And some of them may be more precise than others. And surely, every day, evolutionists are arguing and fighting with each other, because that is what we do. Scientists do not spend their time teaching science, as if it were the truth and we're going to teach it. Normally, scientists will spend 2 or 3 hours a week teaching, and the other 50 or 60 hours of their work week doing research, trying to find out something else, trying to test something, especially trying to test something that somebody tells us must be true. So certainly, as Dr. Gish says, there are evolutionists who say your idea of evolution is nonsense. And certainly there are evolutionists who say this is wrong and this is right and this has to be argued about. This happens all the time. But the overall concept of evolution, that life began in very simple forms and has progressed to very complicated forms, has certainly been amply demonstrated, proven. It's a fact that will not go away. It will be modified. It will be changed. I don't believe we know with any degree of assurance what pushes evolution along, what accounts for the changes. But the fact that it occurs is demonstrable. To show you how completely the scientific community accepts the basic principles, let me point out that when we sent the rockets to Mars in 1976, we were looking for life. And we had to devise experiments to test for life. And it took years of arguing, because the only definition of life that all the biologists agreed on was that life is something that evolves. And this is something that you couldn't test with the simple experiments we were sending to Mars. But the important point is, life is not simple. Of the hundreds of biologists gathered together by NASA to work out the experiments, there was no unanimous agreement on what constitutes life. Clearly, you are alive, and the chair you are sitting on is not alive. This is true for most of you, one or two here. There's a clear distinction between living and non-living. But as you go deep down into the microscopic level, that distinction disappears. Are viruses alive, or are they simply a very complicated molecule? If viruses are alive, how about viruses? Little by little, we run into a very gray area, and nobody knows how to define life or test for it. And so the experiments we sent to Mars were very difficult in looking for life. But here was a clear test of evolutionary theory. Because what we were doing in 1976 was going to a different planet, a pristine planet. One of the big arguments, one of the things scientists worry about in our ideas about the origin of life is that we've only got this one planet to talk about. We don't know how life originated here. We really don't. When we say it evolved, we are begging the question. We don't know how it went from inorganic to living. Even if we find out, all we'll know is this one planet. We have no way of knowing whether this is true all over the universe. So going to Mars was a big thing. Here was a new planet. Would we find the same thing there? Now, a basic precept of evolutionary theory is that if you put things together in the right proportions, somehow life will evolve. And that somehow is a big caveat. And you would like an answer, how? And I can't tell you. Nobody knows. Several different scientists have ideas about how it happens. None of these ideas are accepted by everybody. None of them have progressed to the point where they could be dignified by the name of the theory. We don't know how. But we do think that if you put everything together, you should get life. Everything needs sunlight, liquid water, organic molecules. There was some evidence that these conditions might be met on Mars. And so it would be very exciting to go to Mars and see if we found life there. Now, if we did, according to evolutionary theory, it would have to be very primitive life. Because if Mars has water, it doesn't have much. And if it has sunlight, it doesn't have much. So it's obviously nowhere near as good a place as Earth. And the only forms of life we might possibly expect to find, according to evolutionary theory, are microscopic forms of life, the very beginnings. It could have progressed beyond that. I don't want to say what creationists would predict. I'll leave that to them. But let me simply talk about the evolutionary story. Going to Mars was a test because if we found complicated forms of life without the primitive forms, we would know that the evolution idea was total nonsense. So let me show you what we did find. Could I take a look at that first slide? This is just a pretty picture. This is the rocket taking off from Cape Canaveral, right down the road, on its way to Mars in 1975. It got there in 1976. Along the way, this is what it saw. This is the Mars planet coming up as the planet proceeded toward it. It got closer and went into orbit and circled the planet looking for a place to land. And we saw features like this, mountains bigger than anything on Earth. And then finally, when they picked the proper spot, the orbiter sent a landing craft packed with experiments to look for life. This is a picture of the landing craft back on Earth in a simulated Martian environment to show you what it looks like. And what it has, I can't pick out this particular thing, but basically what it had was a set of experiments with a hook that was going to reach out and scoop up the Martian soil and bring it back inside. And then it was going to conduct a series of mechanized experiments to determine whether or not there was anything living in the soil, any little microbes. At the last moment, before they sent the spaceship out to Mars, somebody, one of the ardent evolutionists, in fact, Carl Sagan, suggested that we better put a television camera on the thing and simply take a look and see what was there. Because maybe, instead of little microbes, we're going to see giant three-legged green Martians walking around. Now, this would be totally against evolutionary concepts. But Sagan argued, we don't know. Wouldn't that be incredibly stupid if we were digging in the soil looking for Martians and these big 8-foot tall creatures were standing around looking at this piece of mechanism and wondering what it was? So they put the television camera on it. That's this thing sitting up here. And the thing landed, it landed safely, And that camera started swiveling around and put together a picture. And if you remember, it was sent live to Earth. This was back in 1976. And on television, we saw live the first picture coming from the surface of Mars. Now I'm lying to you, of course. This is not what we saw. But the point is, it could have been. This is why they put the camera there. And you know, when the camera started taking pictures, and that first shot started coming, we were all hoping that that's what we were going to see. Yes, it would have destroyed evolutionary theory. So what? That's what we live for, is to destroy theories. It would have been so exciting. What we really saw was this: a totally barren landscape. And when we analyzed the soil, we found that the ultraviolet radiation from the sun came blasting in because there was no ozone layer to stop it. And all the organic molecules were shattered. And there was no possibility of any life ever forming. This is too strong a statement, because we've only been to 2 places on Mars, and maybe if we go someplace else, we will find some very tiny microbial forms. But so far, we have found none, and it's perfectly understandable because of its deadly ultraviolet radiation, which incidentally is even more deadly on Earth and is only kept away from us by the ozone layer. I put this in as a plug for environmental problems. We must be aware, we must not let that ozone layer be diminished, because if it is, that is what South Florida is going to end up looking like. I think, although I have some time left, I'm going to finish early, because if you're not tired, I am. I simply want to make one last point very strongly. In this argument, in this debate, please keep in mind, science deals with observational facts and with non-miraculous interpretations. This is a limitation of science that must be recognized. There is no specification that the supernatural does not exist, or that other forms of knowledge beyond the directly observable are unimportant, but simply that science can't help us there. If you want to argue about the relative merits of Beethoven and Mozart, that's an important question. Science has no answer for you. And if you want to argue about whether or not a creator began the Big Bang, or whether it happened spontaneously, science has no answer for you. What science does say is that it could have happened spontaneously. Dr. Gish is very clever at making fun of the seeming illogic of such notions. But those of us that have studied relativity and quantum mechanics know that the universe is a very, very strange place. One of our top scientists, J.R.S. Haldane, generally cautions beginning graduate students by saying, the universe is not only stranger than we imagine, it's stranger than we can imagine. Shakespeare says there are more things in heaven and on earth than are thought of by mere philosophers, and this is true. It's a very, very strange universe. And when we study quantum mechanics, we see things like particles appearing out of nowhere. This is not a violation of the creation of mass energy, and it's not nonsensical. It is an observational fact. We can understand it when we see that these particles that arise out of nothing very quickly decay away again into nothing. And this all happens within what is called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which is a relationship between time and energy density. A possible description of the universe can put the entire universe within the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which means it can arise out of nothing and decay again into nothing, and that's the whole bloody story. The universe could be a simple bubble in space-time, which grows and pops and is gone. There is no proof that this is so. I am not arguing that this is the truth. But this is a possibility. And because such a possibility does not include God, the creationists argue that scientists exclude God. We do not. We are simply saying that if God created the universe, we don't know about it. And there is nothing that we can even think of to test this by any observational test. So we're not going to talk about it. We're not denying it. We're simply not going to talk about it. Evolutionary theory says you start with simple things and they become more complicated. This, to me, is a reasonable way to go about building a population. If I want to build a city, I think I would try to start with the simplest possible thing and go on to more and more complex things. Evolution is a reasonable way for God to have done things. This does not say God does exist. This does not say God does not exist. That concept is completely beyond us. The question is raised. Harry Smith raised it in a newspaper article in the paper today. Why on earth is only one side taught in our schools? Rather than give you an answer to that, I want to attack the question. It's not true that only one side is taught in our schools. If your children go to religious school, as I did, there they learn about the Creator. They learn about the Bible. Then they go to a public school and they learn about science. I think it would be totally wrong to put ideas about a Creator, about miracles, into any discussion of science, not because it's wrong, but because that's not what science deals with. The same sort of thing would be involved if, when you began Genesis, you read, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, footnote. And the footnote says, for an alternative explanation, see your Physics 101 textbook. You don't want that in the Bible. And we don't want, in science textbooks, see this alternative explanation about a creator. It may be true, but it doesn't belong in science. It can't be tested, it's not observational, it doesn't fall within the very limited domain of science. Science's domain is limited. We accept that. If you understand that, you will see there is no conflict between religion and science. They are simply different ways of looking at what ultimately may turn out to be the same thing. But for today, as far as we know, there's simply different ways of looking at things. We have no argument. We have simply nothing to talk about in this respect. Science is separate and should remain separate. Thank you.
Okay, Terry says there'll be some ushers to collect the questions. There is a 10-minute break starting now.